The larger puppy didn't just whine for help. It dragged its frozen, trembling body over its smaller sibling, using its final sparks of warmth to act as a living shield against the Colorado blizzard. This raw act of loyalty shattered FBI Agent Avery Vance's icy resolve, forcing her to stop her SUV and face the ghosts she had been outrunning all night. Before we reveal the dangerous secret hidden beneath the fur of these abandoned puppies, subscribe and stay with us until the end. Please comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of survival travels. The Rockies didn't just have winter. They took possession of the soul, turning every exhaled breath into a ghost and every mistake into a potential gravestone. Avery Vance gripped the steering wheel of her government-issue SUV, still her knuckles white beneath her tactical gloves. The heater was blasting, but she couldn't stop shivering, not from the cold, but from the silence echoing in the cabin. "Just keep driving, Avery," she whispered to herself, her voice a jagged edge in the dark. "Don't think about the door you didn't break in time. Don't think about the child you didn't carry out." Beside her, Atlas, a massive German Shepherd canine with a scar across his muzzle and eyes that had seen too many crime scenes, let out a low, vibrating huff. He nudged her elbow, a silent correction. He knew his partner was spiraling. "I know, Atlas. I'm fine," she lied, her eyes rimmed with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights tunneled through the swirling white chaos, catching a dark, squared shape half buried in a snowbank. Avery's foot hovered over the brake. Her training screamed at her to keep moving, to stick to the mission, to stay invisible. But Atlas sat bolt upright, a sharp, commanding bark cutting through the engine's hum. "What is it? A rock? Debris?" she muttered, though she was already slowing down. She pulled over, the tires hissing against the ice. When she stepped out, the wind slapped her with needles of ice, a brutal welcome back to reality. She approached the object, a warped wooden crate with rusted nails and a split side. She flicked on her flashlight. The beam landed on two tiny black and tan forms curled together so tightly they looked like a single broken heart. "Oh no," Avery breathed, the professional mask finally cracking. "Who would leave you out here?" She reached out, then stopped. She saw the boot prints leading away into the forest, steady, deliberate strides that didn't suggest panic, but calculated abandonment. "Not my job," she told the wind, her voice shaking. "I have a debrief in Millbrook. I'm rationed on feeling, Atlas." She climbed back into the warm SUV and slammed the door. She stared at the crate through the windshield. If she drove away, she could keep her distance. She could keep the loosened part of her soul from rattling free. But as she shifted into drive, she glanced at the rearview mirror. The larger puppy, ears trembling and muzzle rimmed with frost, dragged itself over the smaller, weaker one. It curled its tiny body around its sibling, a shield made of nothing but instinct and raw loyalty. Avery froze. In her mind, the stairwell from last week's failure flashed, the split second that meant the difference between life and silence. "Damn it!" she roared, slamming the brakes. "Atlas, stay!" She ran back into the storm, her boots sinking deep into the powder. She scooped up the puppies. They weighed almost nothing, like contraband hope. She tucked them inside her FBI windbreaker, pressing them against the heat of her own chest. "You're not dying out here," she commanded, her voice clipped. "Not on my watch." Back in the SUV, the dashboard glowed red, making their ice-matted fur look like it was dipped in amber. Atlas leaned over the center console, his nose gently touching the smaller puppy's flank. He looked at Avery, and for the first time in months, the tightness in her chest shifted just a millimeter. "You think we're doing the right thing, Atlas?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Atlas didn't blink. He sat back, his posture tall and confident. Avery pulled onto the road, the tires grinding over the ice, but as she checked the mirror one last time, her stomach dropped. A silhouette stood where the trees met the shoulder, tall, still, and staring straight at her SUV. "Atlas, did you see that?" The dog let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the darkness behind them. The figure didn't move, even as the storm tried to swallow it. "Is someone following us?" Avery whispered, her hands tightening on the wheel. She drove faster toward the distant lights of Millbrook, the puppies whimpering in unison as if they felt the shift in the air. She wasn't just saving lives anymore, she was being tested. They reached Bennett Animal Clinic, to a low wooden structure with icicles hanging like teeth. Avery burst through the door, the smell of antiseptic and wood smoke hitting her like a physical force. "I need help, now!" she shouted. Dr. Claire Bennett, a woman with a braid slipping over her shoulder and eyes that held a calm authority, cleared a steel table with one sweep. She took the puppies, her hands precise and warm. "Hypothermia," Claire murmured, wrapping them in towels under a heat lamp. "We go slow. Who did this?" "I found them on the North Road," Avery said, her voice flat, her eyes reading the room for exits. A boy about 10, Noah, appeared in the doorway, his mop of chestnut hair messy. "Are they okay?" he whispered, his green eyes bright with hope. "They're trying to be," Claire said. As Claire worked, her brow furrowed. She retrieved a handheld scanner and passed it over the smaller puppy's shoulder. A soft, irregular blip filled the quiet room. "What is that?" Avery asked, her instincts waking like coiled wire. "It's not a pet microchip," Claire said, her jaw setting. "Wrong placement, wrong signal. This is deliberate." Avery leaned closer, her sharp cheekbones highlighted by the exam light. "Someone marked them? Why?" "Someone who didn't see them as puppies," Claire said. "Or someone who needed to track something small." Noah's face fell. Who would do that? Avery's gaze flicked to the window, to the white blur beyond. She remembered the silhouette on the road, the crate that seemed to move. "Someone might come looking," Claire said quietly, meeting Avery's gaze. Avery exhaled, a sound that trembled despite her effort. She looked at Atlas, who was already positioned by the door, his ears pinned forward. "Then we should be ready," Avery said, her voice turning into steel. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if in agreement. The night wasn't an ending, it was a summons. Avery Vance, FBI, was no longer just passing through. She had found a mission she couldn't outrun. The warmth of the Bennett Animal Clinic was a sharp, antiseptic contrast to the biting Colorado frost. But for Avery Vance, the air inside felt just as thin. She watched as Claire Bennett's hands, steady and experienced, navigated the fragile lives of the two puppies, while Atlas remained a silent, fur-covered shadow near the entrance. The soft, irregular blip of the scanner echoed like a countdown in the small room, a mechanical heartbeat that confirmed Avery's worst fears. "That signal is encrypted." "Avery," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper as she glanced toward the dark window where the storm continued its assault. Avery's jaw tightened, the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a lead vest. She reached for her radio, her fingers hovering over the dial as she looked at Noah, who was staring at the smaller puppy with a fierce, protective concentration. "I thought I was done with this, Atlas," she murmured, more to the dog than to herself, her eyes reflecting a weariness that went deeper than the current mission. The first mini-climax shattered the quiet when a heavy thud vibrated through the clinic's side door, followed by the sharp, metallic click of a latch being tested. Atlas didn't bark. He simply stood, his hackles rising in a silent, lethal warning that made the hair on Avery's neck stand up. "Noah, get behind the counter! Now!" Avery commanded, her voice dropping into the low, dangerous register of a field agent. Claire grabbed her son, her face pale but her eyes fixed on Avery for direction. The calm authority of the clinic replaced by the raw instinct of survival. The door groaned under a second, more violent impact, and for a heartbeat, Avery saw the silhouette from the road. Tall, still, and impossibly patient, outlined against the frosted glass. "They aren't here for the dogs, Claire. They're here for what's inside them," Avery hissed, drawing her service weapon with a fluid, practiced motion. The major twist arrived when the scanner in Claire's hand suddenly shrieked a continuous tone, indicating the device under the puppy's skin had been remotely activated to transmit a high-frequency location beacon. "The chip. It's live. They know exactly where we are," Claire cried out, her hands shaking as she tried to cover the puppies with more towels, as if she could hide the signal itself. Avery didn't hesitate. She grabbed a lead-lined surgical vest from the X-ray room and threw it over the puppies, dampening the signal instantly and plunging the room back into a tense, vibrating silence. The scratching at the door stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the howl of the wind to fill the void. "We can't stay here," Avery said, her mind already mapping the grid search patterns she knew the local sheriff would use once she made the call. But Noah's reaction was a mini-climax of its own. The boy's anger flared, a sudden, desperate rejection of the violence Avery brought into his home. "You're just like them. You bring trouble and then you tell us to run," he snapped, his voice cracking with a fear he refused to admit. Before Claire could stop him, Noah yanked open the side door, driven by a 10-year-old's impulsive need to escape the suffocating tension. The cold poured in like an accusation, and Noah vanished into the white blur of the storm before Avery could even reach the threshold. "Noah! No!" Claire screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the wind as she tried to follow him into the drifts. Avery caught her by the arm, her grip firm but not unkind. "Stay with the puppies, Claire. If they find the clinic empty, they'll burn it. I'll get him back. I promise." Avery stepped out into the blizzard, the needles of ice stinging her face as she followed the faint, disappearing trail of a boy and two puppies who had somehow managed to scramble after him. Atlas led the way, his nose low to the ground, his body a powerful engine moving through the powder with a confidence Avery envied. The dramatic tension ratcheted up as the forest swallowed them, the pines rising like black walls that seemed to lean in, whispering the names of the cases Avery had failed. Every shadow looked like the man in the hunting coat. Every snap of a branch sounded like a rifle being cocked. Avery's heart hammered against her ribs, her vision tunneling as the memory of the stairwell tried to pull her under again. "Not now, Avery. Focus on the tracks," she gasped, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged plumes. A major twist hit when she found Noah's knit cap snagged on a rusted iron trap. The metal jaws snapped shut on nothing but air, a chilling reminder that they weren't the only ones hunting in these woods. A sharp, commanding bark from Atlas cut through the noise in her head. Avery sprinted toward the sound, her boots sinking deep into the drifts, until she saw a small shape curled beside a fallen log. It was Noah, his lips tinged blue, his chest rising too slowly as the cold began to take possession of his small frame. Sky was pressed against his chest, her tiny body lending what little heat she had left, while Ace circled them like a miniature sentry. "I've got you, Noah. I've got you," Avery whispered, shedding her windbreaker to wrap it around the shivering boy. She lifted him, her muscles straining under the weight, her mind flashing to the child she hadn't carried out. This time the door wasn't too late. This time she wasn't going to let the silence win. As they struggled back toward the dim yellow halo of the clinic, a low, humorless laugh echoed from the trees behind them. Avery didn't turn around. She knew the silhouette was there, watching, waiting for the storm to do his work for him. "You're safe now, Noah," she said, her voice turning into steel as she saw Claire running toward them from the porch, her face streaked with tears of raw relief. Inside the clinic, the heat wrapped around them again, but the victory felt fragile, a hairline fracture spreading through glass. Avery watched as Claire clutched Noah, the gratitude and fear tangling in her expression, and realized that for the first time in months, she had saved something that wouldn't appear in an official report. But the blip on the scanner, muffled beneath the lead vest, began to speed up, a rhythmic, insistent pulse that told her the night was far from over. "They're coming, aren't they?" Noah whispered from the safety of his mother's arms, his green eyes no longer hopeful, but sharpened by the reality of the forest. Avery looked at Atlas, who had resumed his post by the door, his amber eyes fixed on the white blur beyond the glass. She checked the magazine of her weapon, the cold, hard reality of the mission overriding the warmth of the room. "Yes," Avery said quietly, her voice settling into a final, unwavering resolve. "And this time, we'll be ready for them." The fragile warmth of the clinic felt like a lie as the storm rattled the window panes, the wind scraping against the wooden walls with a renewed appetite for destruction. Avery Vance stood by the counter, steering her hands steady as she reloaded her weapon, though her chest remained tight with the memory of the frozen forest. Claire Bennett was kneeling by Noah, whispering reassurances that were swallowed by the low hum of the heat lamps, while Atlas remained a silent, lethal sentinel at the door. The silence was broken not by the wind, but by a sharp, electronic chirp from the scanner beneath the lead vest, a faster, more aggressive rhythm that told Avery the hunters were no longer just tracking. They were closing in. "Claire, take Noah to the back room and lock the door," Avery commanded, her voice turning into the steel that had defined her career. Claire didn't argue this time. She saw the look in Avery's eyes, the eyes that didn't sleep, even when the body did. Noah clutched his flashlight, shooting his green eyes reflecting a terror that was rapidly hardening into a survivor's resolve. As the door to the storage room clicked shut, the first mini-climax struck. A brick shattered the front window, sending shards of glass flying like ice diamonds into the room. Atlas didn't bark. He lunged toward the opening, his teeth bared in a snarl that vibrated through the floorboards. "I know you're in there, Special Agent Vance," a voice called out from the white blur of the storm, rough and unconcerned. It was the man in the hunting coat, his tone carrying the arrogance of someone who measured the world by what he could take. Avery didn't respond with words. She shifted her weight, balancing her center of gravity, and signaled Atlas to hold his position. A second brick came, followed by the acrid, metallic smell of a smoke canister rolling across the tile. The room began to fill with a thick, choking gray, and Avery realized with a jolt of adrenaline that they weren't just coming for the pups. They were trying to flush her out into a kill zone. A profound twist arrived when the side door, the one Noah had used to escape earlier, was kicked open with such force that the hinges screamed. But it wasn't the man with the rifle who stepped through. It was Deputy Mark Harland, his face bloodied and his uniform torn. "Avery, don't shoot! The sheriff! He's part of it!" Harland gasped, his voice cracking as he collapsed against the wall. The realization hit Avery like a punch to the gut. The network wasn't just a few traffickers in the woods. It was the very law she had intended to call for help. "Harland, stay down!" Avery yelled as the man in the hunting coat appeared in the front window, his rifle leveled. The dramatic tension surged as the man didn't fire at Avery. He fired at the lead vest protecting the puppies. The impact sent the pups tumbling. Ace let out a sharp bark of defiance, while Skye whimpered in a way that made Avery's blood run cold. Avery returned fire, the muzzle flashes illuminating the smoke-filled room in jagged bursts of orange. She wasn't just fighting for a case anymore. She was fighting for the two small lives that had begun to fix the broken parts of her soul. A mini-climax flared when Atlas disappeared into the smoke, his heavy weight leaning into the darkness as he pursued a second intruder who had entered through the shattered window. Avery heard the struggle, the sound of fabric tearing and a man's shriek of pain, but she couldn't see her partner. "Atlas, return!" she shouted, her voice breaking with a fear she hadn't felt in years. The dog emerged from the haze, his dark muzzle stained with more than just snow, his eyes fixed on the man with the rifle outside. "You can't save them all, Avery!" the man roared from the darkness, his voice mocking her past failures. "The chip is a beacon, and we have the receiver. You're just a ghost in a windbreaker." The psychological blow hit home, tunneling Avery's vision back to that empty child's room. But this time, a warm pressure nudged her boot. Skye had crawled out from under the towels, her lighter fur matted with dust, her chin resting against Avery's foot as if she had decided this was where safety lived. The major twist came when Harland handed Avery his radio, his fingers trembling. "Listen, they aren't just migration tags. They're encrypted storage. The information on those chips, it's the ledger for the whole operation." The puppies weren't just victims. They were the evidence that could burn the entire network to the ground. Avery realized the man outside wasn't trying to retrieve the pups. He was trying to destroy the evidence and everyone who had seen it. "Claire, get out of the back. The shed. Go to the shed!" Avery screamed, remembering the fuel and medical kits stored there. She grabbed the puppies, tucking them back into her jacket, and signaled Harland to move. They burst through the side door into the renewed storm, the wind hitting like a wall and stealing their breath. The searchlight of a cruiser appeared at the edge of the parking lot, but it wasn't a rescue. It was a hunter. The dramatic rhythm of the night turned into a desperate sprint toward the tree line. Avery slipped on the ice, pain flaring as she hit the ground hard, the cold seeping deep into her bones. For a moment, the storm seemed ready to claim her, the white blur of the mountains taking offense at her defiance. Then Ace's weight leaned into her, solid and insistent, while Atlas stood over her, his growl a warning that needed no translation. "I've got you," Avery whispered to the pups, hauling herself up and fighting her way back toward the darkness of the pines. Behind them, the clinic erupted into flames, the yellow light of the fire reflected in the falling snow. The man in the hunting coat stepped into the firelight, his rifle raised, his silhouette tall and steady against the roaring wind. He didn't fire yet. He was waiting for the storm to corner them, unaware that Avery Vance was no longer running. She reached for her radio, her voice low and clipped as she spoke into the frequency. She knew the regional FBI office was monitoring. "This is Agent Vance. I have the ledger. I am Stan." The orange glow of the burning clinic reflected in the falling snow, turning the blizzard into a shifting maze of amber shadows and bone-chilling cold. Avery Vance didn't look back at the destruction of the only sanctuary she had found. She kept her eyes on the black wall of the pine forest, her boots biting into the crusted drifts as she carried the two puppies pressed against her racing heart. Beside her, Deputy Harland stumbled, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps that mirrored the desperate state of the law in Millbrook. "They won't stop at the clinic, Avery," Harland wheezed, his voice nearly lost to the hungry howl of the wind. "The sheriff knows that if those puppies reach the regional office, his life is over." The first mini-climax shattered the rhythm of their retreat when a searchlight from a second cruiser cut through the trees, its white beam swinging wildly like a searching eye. Atlas let out a low, vibrating growl, his hackles rising as he positioned his massive frame between the light and Avery. "Get down," Avery commanded, shoving Harland behind a fallen oak as the searchlight swept just inches above their heads. The mechanical roar of an engine grew louder, a predator circling in the white void. And Avery realized with a jolt of adrenaline that they weren't just being hunted, they were being hemmed in. "Avery, look at Sky," Harland whispered, pointing to the smaller puppy tucked inside her jacket. The light-colored pup was shaking violently, but not just from the cold. She was letting out a high-pitched, rhythmic whimper that seemed to synchronize with a faint, red pulse coming from beneath her fur. The major twist hit Avery like a punch to the gut. The lead vest she had used at the clinic had been left behind in the fire. The chip was no longer muffled. They were walking beacons in the dark, broadcasting their exact coordinates to every receiver the hunters possessed. "We have to cut it out," Avery said, her voice turning into the cold steel of a field agent facing an impossible choice. She reached for her tactical knife, her hands trembling as she looked at the fragile life in her arms. But before she could move, Atlas barked sharply, his head snapping toward the deeper woods where a series of metallic clicks echoed through the trees. It wasn't the sound of a rifle. It was the sound of steel traps being triggered in sequence, a primitive alarm system designed to catch the careless. The man in the hunting coat. He didn't just set traps for animals, Avery hissed, pulling her hand back as a rusted iron jaw snapped shut just inches from her boot. The psychological pressure intensified as she realized the entire forest had been turned into a kill zone, where every step was a gamble with a steel predator. A mini-climax flared when a figure emerged from the snow, not from behind them, but from the path ahead. It was Noah, his face pale and tear-streaked, clutching a heavy iron wrench he must have scavenged from the shed. "I saw them, Special Agent Vance. They're at the bridge," Noah cried, his voice small but firm against the storm. Avery grabbed the boy, pulling him into the shadow of the fallen log. "Noah, you were supposed to stay with Claire." The boy shook his head, his green eyes reflecting a fierce, new maturity. "Mom sent me to find the old ranger trail. It's the only way that isn't mapped on the sheriff's GPS." The dramatic rhythm shifted as Avery looked at the boy, then at Atlas, and finally at the puppies. The loosened part of her soul wasn't rattling anymore. It was forging itself into a shield. The second major twist arrived when Avery's radio crackled to life, but it wasn't the FBI regional office. It was the sheriff's voice, calm and chillingly reasonable. "Avery, I know you're listening. You think you're saving those pups, but you're just carrying the keys to a kingdom you don't understand. The chip isn't a ledger. It's an access code to a federal witness protection database. The realization turned the mission upside down. The traffickers weren't just moving animals or timber. They were selling the locations of people who had been erased for their own safety. "You're a traitor, Frank!" Avery roared into the radio, her voice echoing through the pines. The answer was a single high-caliber shot that shattered the frozen branch above her head. A mini-climax erupted as Atlas lunged forward, not toward the shooter, but toward Noah, pushing the boy flat into the snow just as a second bullet hissed through the space where he had been standing. Avery returned fire, the muzzle flashes of her sidearm illuminating the swirling flakes in jagged bursts of orange. "Run! To the ranger trail! Atlas, lead them!" Avery commanded, her voice a whip crack of authority. She stood her ground, acting as the decoy, her flashlight beam swinging toward the main road to draw the searchlights away from Harland and the children. The man in the hunting coat stepped out of the fog, his rifle leveled with a terrifying, unhurried grace. "You have the same eyes as the people I usually catch, Agent," he said, his voice rough and devoid of humor. "The ones who think they can change the ending by being stubborn." The dramatic tension reached a breaking point as Avery felt the cold biting into her bandaged palms. The weight of her failures and her hopes balanced on the trigger of her weapon. She didn't blink as the man took a deliberate step closer, the iron jaws of another trap hidden beneath the snow between them. "I'm not trying to change the ending," Avery replied, her voice settling into a final, unwavering resolve. "I'm just making sure you don't get to write it." In that split second, the larger puppy, Ace, broke free from Noah's grasp and bolted back toward Avery, his dark muzzle lifted in a fierce, juvenile bark. The distraction caused the hunter's aim to flicker for a heartbeat, and Avery took the shot. The man fell back, his rifle spinning into the drifts, but as Avery lunged to secure him, a third major twist hit. A low mechanical hum began to vibrate through the earth, and the sky above the tree line glowed with the unnatural red of a regional wildfire. Except there was no fire, only the massive thermal signature of a federal extraction team arriving too late to be a rescue, but exactly in time to be a witness. Avery stood in the middle of the storm, the two pups at her feet and her canine partner at her side, realizing that the miracle wasn't the extraction. It was the fact that she was still there to see it. The mechanical roar of the federal extraction team tore through the mountain silence. But for Avery Vance, the world had narrowed to the shallow, terrified breathing of the two puppies huddled against her boots. She didn't look at the sky as the massive thermal signatures of the Black Hawk helicopters began to descend. She watched the man in the hunting coat struggle to his feet, his face a mask of primal fury. "You think this is a rescue, Agent?" He spat, clutching his shoulder where Avery's shot had found its mark. Avery didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, her hand resting on Atlas's neck, her presence a silent declaration of war. The first mini-climax flared when the sheriff's cruiser, lights spinning in a dizzying strobe of red and blue, lurched forward from the tree line, intent on crushing the evidence and the puppies before the feds touched the ground. Atlas lunged, not at the car, but at Avery, shoving her and the pups toward a jagged outcrop of rock just as the cruiser slammed into the fallen oak they had been using for cover. The impact sent a spray of splinters into the air, one catching Avery's cheek, adding a fresh line of red to her frost-bitten skin. Avery didn't flinch. She rolled, coming up with her weapon leveled at the sheriff's windshield. "Stop the car, Frank! It's over!" she roared, her voice finally breaking through the storm's howl. A profound twist arrived when the sheriff didn't stop, but instead threw the door open while the vehicle was still moving. He wasn't reaching for his gun. He was clutching a remote detonator. "The ledger isn't just data, Avery. It's a failsafe," he screamed over the rotors. The realization hit Avery like a physical blow. The chips inside the puppies weren't just beacons. They were linked to incendiary devices planted throughout the town's infrastructure. If the signal was cut, or the puppies left the Millbrook perimeter, the very people Avery was trying to save would go up in flames. "Claire! Noah! Stay back!" Avery screamed as the first federal boots hit the snow. She tackled the sheriff, her muscles straining against the weight of his betrayal, while Atlas circled them, his growls a ferocious rhythm of protection. The dramatic tension ratcheted up as the federal lead, a man with cold eyes and a badge that matched Avery's, stepped into the light. "Agent Vance, step away from the suspect. We have orders to secure the assets, meaning the dogs, at any cost." Avery looked at her own people and saw the same calculation she had once used herself. She realized then that the threat didn't just have a face, it had a bureau. The pace of the morning accelerated into a blur of frantic action and psychological warfare. Avery backed toward the ranger trail, her fingers entwined in the fur of Ace and Sky, who were now leaning into her with a trust that felt like a miracle. "They aren't assets, they're lives," she shouted at her superiors. A mini-climax erupted when the man in the hunting coat lunged for Sky, a concealed blade flashing in the moonlight. Atlas intercepted him mid-air, a 70-pound blur of teeth and fury that sent the hunter sprawling into the drifts. A second major twist hit when Harland, bleeding out against a pine tree, handed Avery a crumpled photo he'd pulled from the sheriff's pocket. It wasn't a map or a list. It was a photo of Avery herself, taken months ago in Washington. The network hadn't just been tracking migration. They had been tracking her. The puppies were the bait, and she was the real prize. The entire Millbrook assignment had been a long-game trap to force her into a position where she would save the very information they needed to leak. "You wanted me to find them," Avery whispered, the horror settling into her bones. She looked at the puppies, then at the federal team, and realized that if she handed them over, she was fulfilling the trafficker's final goal. The loosened part of her soul didn't just rattle. It forged into a singular, burning resolve to burn the plan down. She didn't wait for a command. She turned to Noah, who was standing by the shed with Claire. "Noah, the fuel. Now." The dramatic rhythm turned into a desperate, fiery gambit. As the boy threw a fuel canister toward the center of the clearing, Avery fired a single shot. The resulting explosion created a wall of heat and fire that momentarily blinded the federal sensors and the sheriff's men alike. In the chaos, Avery, Atlas, and the puppies vanished into the shadows of the ranger trail. They didn't run toward the helicopters. They ran toward the only place where second chances lived. By the time the storm finally broke at dawn, the forest was a glittering, silent witness to the night's wreckage. Avery stood at the edge of the Millbrook Ridge, watching the federal teams pick through the embers of the clinic. She had the chips in her hand, removed with Claire's surgical precision in the back of the shed. They were no longer beacons. They were just cold pieces of metal that held the names of everyone who had ever been erased. A final profound twist occurred when Deputy Harland, now stabilized by the federal medics, looked at Avery and gave a slow, tired nod. He hadn't reported their location. The community of Millbrook, the neighbors who had shared generators and coffee, had formed a silent circle of protection, around the Harbor Light Rescue. They didn't see an FBI agent or a fugitive. They saw the woman who had stopped when everyone else kept driving. Avery Reed didn't call Washington. She didn't file an official report. She watched Ace and Sky tumble clumsily in the fresh snow, their barks a defiant, joyful sound that echoed through the pines. Atlas sat beside her, his self-appointed role as guardian finally easing into a watchful peace. The house had learned their names, the dogs had learned her rhythms, and for the first time in years, the ghosts that chased Madison Reed found no place left to hide. Avery looked at the wooden sign Noah had nailed to the gate, the letters uneven but proud. Harbor Light Rescue, where second chances live. She realized that miracles don't arrive with thunder or blazing light, but in the hands that reach out and the courage to stay when the storm is at its loudest. Avery Vance was no longer passing through. She was home. Avery Vance had spent her life chasing ghosts in the dark, only to find her redemption in the small, warm lives she chose to protect when the rest of the world chose to keep driving.